No one wanted the injured Apache woman. Until a cowboy stopped them with gold, the sun was just beginning to rise over the small frontier town, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. The air was dry and heavy, carrying the faint scent of smoke from the chimneys of the few wooden houses that lined the main road. It was early morning, and most of the townspeople were just beginning their day, sweeping the sidewalks, feeding horses, or preparing breakfast over small iron stoves. Life in the town was never easy. Every day was a struggle for survival, but the people had grown used to the hardships. They knew the land could be harsh and unforgiving, yet they carried on with a quiet, stubborn pride. On this particular morning, something unusual stirred the town. From the far edge of the settlement, a small group of people hurried toward the center. In their midst was a woman. She could hardly be called a woman by the standards of the town's folk. She was frail, her clothes torn and soaked with blood, and her face was pale and strained. One of her legs was clearly injured, and she leaned heavily on the shoulders of the men trying to carry her. Her dark hair clung to her face, matted with sweat and dust. Every step seemed to take an enormous effort, and with every step, a groan of pain escaped her lips. The crowd began to gather naturally as the unusual sight made its way through the town. People stopped whatever they were doing and stared. Their faces showed a mixture of fear, curiosity, and unease. They whispered among themselves, exchanging glances that spoke more than words ever could. Some muttered about her being Native American. Some shook their heads, worried about what might follow if she was allowed to stay. Others simply looked away, pretending not to notice. The doctor of the town, a man in his 50s with graying hair and a stern face, stepped out of his clinic when he heard the commotion. His hands were covered in blood from attending to a horse that had been injured the night before, and he frowned as he saw the woman. "Not her," he said under his breath. "Not here, not now." The murmurs of the crowd grew louder. "She's hurt," one person said timidly. "She needs help," another shouted, but the doctor waved them off. "I don't treat her kind," he said, his voice firm and final. "If you want her to live, that's your problem, not mine." The people exchanged nervous glances. No one wanted to argue with the doctor. He was the only one in town who knew how to care for the sick or wounded properly, and challenging him could bring trouble. But at the same time, no one wanted to touch the injured woman either. Fear of the unknown, fear of trouble, and old prejudices kept their hands in their pockets and their voices quiet. The woman lay on the ground, her breathing shallow, and her dark eyes looked around in desperation. She did not speak the language of the town, but even so, her fear and pain were clear to anyone who looked closely. Her lips trembled as if she wanted to say something, to beg for help, but she had no words that anyone could understand. The townspeople's discomfort grew. Some whispered that she might carry disease. Others speculated that she could be dangerous if left alone. And still, no one moved forward. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of the crowd. He was tall, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face from the sun, and his boots crunched on the dry earth as he walked toward the group. His presence was calm but commanding. There was a sense of confidence about him, a quiet authority that seemed to make people notice him even before he spoke. The townspeople instinctively parted to make room for him. He observed the scene carefully, taking in the fear in the townspeople's eyes and the pain on the woman's face. His gaze was steady, and for a moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice that was calm but firm, he addressed the crowd. "Why is no one helping her?" he asked. His tone was not angry, but it carried weight, and people felt an uncomfortable chill as they realized they had no answer. A man standing near the front muttered, She's Apache. We don't know her. She could be dangerous." Others nodded quietly and some crossed their arms trying to appear neutral. The cowboy shook his head slowly. "Dangerous," he said. "She's hurt, she's human. That's all that matters." His words were simple, but they carried a powerful truth that hung in the air. The woman's eyes flickered toward him as if she could sense that he was different. She tried to move toward him, but her injured leg would not allow it. She whimpered softly, a sound so small that it almost went unnoticed, but the cowboy heard it. He crouched down slightly, keeping his hands empty and open, showing her that he meant no harm. "It's all right," he said gently. "I'll help you." The townspeople stared, unsure of what to do. Some were fascinated, some suspicious, but no one spoke. They had never seen anyone act with such quiet courage before. The doctor, standing off to the side, scowled. "You don't know what you're doing," he said. "You could get hurt or worse. Leave her alone." But the cowboy did not move back. Instead, he stepped closer to the woman, offering his support. With a careful hand under her shoulders and another under her knees, he lifted her slightly, taking most of her weight himself. The woman let out a small sigh of relief. Even though she did not understand his words, she seemed to understand the gesture. She was no longer completely alone. The crowd murmured again, some with surprise, others with disapproval. "Why is he helping her?" a woman whispered to her neighbor. "She doesn't belong here." The neighbor shrugged. "Maybe he's crazy," she said, but the cowboy did not care what they thought. He focused on the woman's condition, noticing the cuts on her arms and legs, the dried blood in her hair, and the way her breathing was uneven. He carried her toward a small shaded area near the center of town, where the morning sun was less harsh. He gently laid her down on a blanket that one of the townspeople had reluctantly brought. He knelt beside her, examining the wounds as best as he could with his limited supplies. The woman flinched at first, but then relaxed slightly when she realized he was not hurting her. She pressed her hand against his, a silent gesture of trust. Hours passed. The townspeople watched, some from a distance, some closer, still unsure of what to do. The woman's condition slowly began to stabilize under the cowboy's care. He cleaned her wounds as best as he could, applied simple dressings, and even found some water for her to drink. Every now and then, he looked up at the crowd, meeting their eyes and silently asking them to reconsider their fear and prejudice. By mid-afternoon, the sun was high in the sky, and the woman had stopped bleeding as much as before. She had not yet smiled, but her eyes were calmer. She leaned slightly toward the cowboy, and he remained close, ready to respond to any need. The tension in the crowd started to shift. Some people, seeing that the woman posed no immediate threat, began to feel guilty for their earlier hesitation. But the question of what to do next hung heavy over the town. The doctor had not come forward. No one else was willing to provide real care. The woman's survival still depended largely on the cowboy, and he seemed to know this. He did not complain, nor did he express frustration. He simply continued to care for her quietly, with patience and determination. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long golden rays across the town, the cowboy finally stood and addressed the people once more. "She needs more than just a few hours of care," he said. "Someone has to help her until she can walk again. She is weak, and if she doesn't get proper care, she may not make it through the night." His words carried a quiet urgency that could not be ignored. The crowd looked at one another, uneasy. They wanted to leave, to return to their chores and their lives. But something in the cowboy's words, something in the steady look in his eyes made them pause. The woman, hearing his voice, turned her head slightly toward him, and though she could not speak, the trust in her gaze was unmistakable. It was clear to everyone present that she could not survive on her own. And for the first time that day, the townspeople began to feel a small stir of conscience. Some shifted uncomfortably, others lowered their heads, realizing that doing nothing could mean the end of a human life. The cowboy, however, did not wait for them to act. He made a silent decision, one that was clear in the determined set of his jaw and the firm set of his shoulders. He would not let her die. As evening approached, the first stars began to twinkle in the sky. The woman lay quietly on the blanket, her body exhausted but her spirit faintly revived by the presence of someone who truly cared. The cowboy sat beside her, keeping watch, aware that the town's eyes were still on him. He did not speak much. There was no need. His actions spoke louder than any words ever could. And as the night fell, the town began to understand slowly that a life had value far beyond fear, suspicion, or old grudges. That one person's courage and compassion could make the difference between life and death. The woman's fate, for now, rested in the hands of this lone cowboy, whose kindness shone like a quiet beacon in the darkness. The next morning, the town awoke to a quiet that felt heavier than usual. The events of the previous day had left a mark on the townspeople, though few wanted to admit it. They moved through their routine slowly, their eyes flicking occasionally toward the small area where the cowboy and the injured Apache woman still stayed. Some whispered among themselves, uneasy, unsure what to make of the strange man who had stepped in when no one else dared. Others tried to ignore the scene, but the memory of her fragile figure and his calm determination lingered in their minds. The cowboy had spent the night beside the woman, making sure she was safe and as comfortable as possible. Though she was still weak, she had not worsened. Her breathing had steadied, and the panic in her eyes had softened slightly. When the first light of dawn filtered through the wooden structures of the town, the cowboy gently checked her injuries again. The bandages were soaked in dried blood, but they were holding, and he cleaned them as best as he could with water and cloth. "You'll need more help soon," he muttered softly, speaking to her though she could not understand his words. She looked at him with wide eyes, but there was no fear this time, only a quiet trust that seemed to grow with every passing hour. He could see it, the way she followed his movements with her gaze, the way her hand twitched slightly as if wanting to reach for his when she could. The townspeople were beginning to gather again, though at a greater distance than yesterday. A few brave ones lingered near the edges, watching curiously, whispering quietly among themselves. "Why does he care so much?" one woman asked another. "She isn't from here, we don't even know her." "I don't know," the neighbor replied, "but he's different, he's not afraid." Indeed, the cowboy was different. His presence was calm but commanding, and it carried a sense of fairness that was rare in a town that had learned to survive by fear and caution. He did not shout or threaten, he simply acted. Every small gesture he made, handing her water, adjusting her blankets, offering comfort without forcing it, showed patience and understanding. The townspeople began to notice that it was not only her life at stake, but also their own moral conscience. Some of them whispered about fear. They worried that helping her could bring trouble, that her Apache identity might anger others, or that she could be dangerous. But they also saw something else, a courage and decency that they themselves lacked, a willingness to act when action was needed most. The contrast was sharp, and it made them uncomfortable. The cowboy knew the challenge was not only to save her physically, but also to bridge the fear that separated her from the townspeople. He needed someone to understand her, to help her recover, and he also needed the town to see her as a human being, not as a threat. Slowly, he began to approach the people with gentle words and gestures, though he knew it would take time. "I will pay anyone willing to help her," he said, his voice calm but clear. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small pouch of gold coins. The metallic jingling as he opened it caught the attention of everyone around. "I don't care why you do it," he continued. "If someone will care for her, I will make it worth your effort. She needs to survive. That is all that matters." The townspeople were taken aback. Gold in this town carried more weight than almost anything else. It could buy food, supplies, and even a measure of influence. For many, the offer forced them to reconsider their hesitation. Greed, or perhaps simply the hope of reward, began to outweigh their fear. Slowly, some stepped forward, some reluctantly agreeing to help care for the woman under the cowboy's supervision. Even with the promise of gold, however, it was clear that the true work of recovery would fall mostly to the cowboy. He had learned quickly that the town was slow to act without motivation, and that many still carried old prejudices in their hearts. Yet he did not complain. Instead, he continued to care for the woman, speaking to her softly, moving gently to avoid causing her pain, and constantly adjusting her position to reduce discomfort. In the quiet moments, he began to learn more about her story. Through gestures, broken phrases, and simple communication, he discovered that she had been traveling alone, separated from her family during a violent conflict. Her injuries were a result of a recent attack, and she had been wandering, trying to find safety. Despite the language barrier, the cowboy could understand the fear in her eyes, the exhaustion in her movements, and the faint glimmer of hope that he represented. As the morning turned into afternoon, the woman's condition improved slightly under the cowboy's care. The townspeople began to notice, and the whispers turned into quiet acknowledgement. Some were still reluctant, still judging her from afar, but they could no longer deny the impact of the cowboy's kindness. He worked tirelessly, fetching clean water, tending to her wounds, and speaking gently in a voice that was both firm and soothing. One young man, barely more than a boy, watched from a distance. Inspired by the cowboy's courage, he quietly fetched a small bowl of food and left it beside her. The cowboy noticed but said nothing, only offering a small nod of approval. The gesture was small but significant. It marked the first real sign that the town's fear could begin to be replaced with compassion. By late afternoon, the woman was able to sit up slightly, leaning on the cowboy for support. Her eyes, which had been wide with fear, now followed his every movement with a sense of recognition. Though she still could not speak, her trust in him was evident. He spoke to her softly, explaining in simple words what he was doing, even though she might not understand them fully. The act itself seemed to reassure her. The townspeople, watching silently, began to realize the truth in his actions. The woman was no longer a stranger or a threat. She was a person in need. And the cowboy, through patience, courage, and quiet determination, had shown them the value of compassion. Some felt shame for their earlier hesitation, realizing that fear and prejudice had clouded their judgment. Others simply remained silent, unsure how to express the complex emotions rising within them. As evening approached, the shadows grew longer, and the town settled into a tentative calm. The cowboy stayed by the woman's side, keeping watch as the golden light of sunset fell across the dusty streets. She rested, her breathing more even, and for the first time in days there was a sense of safety in her eyes. Though the danger was not gone, though the town's acceptance was still uncertain, she had someone to rely on, someone who would not turn away. The cowboy understood that this was only the beginning. The woman needed more than temporary care. She needed protection, nourishment, and time to recover fully. And he also knew that the town needed to be taught a lesson in humanity, that fear and prejudice could be replaced with courage and compassion. The task ahead was not easy, but he had already proven that one person's determination could make a difference. Night fell and the stars twinkled faintly above the small town. The woman lay on the blanket, exhausted but alive, while the cowboy remained close, vigilant and patient. The townspeople had begun to return to their homes, their minds heavy with thoughts they could not ignore. The quiet streets seemed to echo with the truth of what they had witnessed. That bravery was not only about facing enemies, but also about standing up for what was right, even when others would not. As he settled in for the night beside the woman, the cowboy looked out across the town one last time before sleep approached. He knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, he had done what was necessary. He had intervened when no one else would, and he had shown a young, injured woman that her life mattered. And perhaps, quietly, he had begun to show the town the same lesson. The following morning, the town awoke to the soft glow of sunlight spilling over the rooftops, casting warm, golden light across the dusty streets. Birds chirped quietly in the distance, and the usual sounds of a frontier town, horses neighing, wagon wheels creaking, and people calling to one another, slowly filled the air. Yet, amidst the ordinary morning activity, the presence of the injured Apache woman and the lone cowboy still lingered in the minds of the townspeople. Her story had begun to spread quietly from person to person, whispered in hushed tones, carried along by curiosity, guilt, and wonder. The woman was still weak, but her breathing had become steadier overnight. The cowboy had kept a careful watch beside her, ensuring that she was safe, and that no one in the town could take advantage of her vulnerable state. He had barely slept, listening for any unusual sound or movement, making sure her blanket stayed warm and that her water and small meals were nearby. Though she could not speak his language, the cowboy had grown used to interpreting her gestures and expressions, learning to read her small movements as signs of comfort, fear, or pain. As he gently adjusted her blanket and offered her a sip of water, she looked up at him. For a moment, the corners of her lips twitched, almost like a smile, and her dark eyes held a faint sparkle that had not been there before. It was a small victory, but to the cowboy, it meant everything. Slowly, steadily, she was beginning to trust him, and that trust was the first step toward recovery. Outside, the townspeople watched from a distance. A few had come closer than yesterday, lingering near the edge of the street, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening without drawing attention to themselves. Their curiosity had grown. Some were still skeptical, uncertain if helping her was the right thing to do, but others began to feel a quiet stirring of conscience. They had seen how the cowboy cared for her without complaint, how his actions were guided by decency and patience rather than fear or greed. A young boy, barely old enough to work in the fields, quietly approached the blanket where the woman rested. His small hands carried a cup of water and a piece of bread he had taken from his own breakfast. He knelt a short distance away, uncertain if he was welcome, and offered the food with a shy gesture. The cowboy noticed immediately. He gave the boy a slight nod of approval, showing that the gesture, however small, mattered. The woman accepted the food with a faint movement of her hand, and the boy's face brightened at the small acknowledgement. The morning passed slowly. The cowboy worked tirelessly, not only caring for her physical injuries, but also comforting her in ways that words could not convey. He would adjust her blanket, smooth the dirt from her hair, and hum quietly in a gentle tone. Though she did not understand the words, she seemed to sense the kindness behind them, and her body relaxed slightly under his presence. The townspeople began to notice subtle changes. Some saw the woman lift her head to drink water on her own. Others noticed her eyes following the cowboy as he moved around her. A few even saw her attempt to stretch her injured leg carefully, wincing but determined. Slowly, the fear that had gripped the town began to fade, replaced with curiosity and cautious admiration. People began to whisper among themselves that perhaps she was not as weak or helpless as they had thought. By mid-morning, a few of the townspeople had tentatively stepped forward, offering small assistance. One woman brought a clean cloth to replace the soaked bandages, while another brought fresh water. The cowboy directed them gently, showing them how to help without causing pain. At first, they were clumsy, unsure of what to do, but he guided them patiently. His quiet authority and example inspired them to take action, even if only in small ways. As the day wore on, the woman began to communicate more clearly through gestures and expressions. She would point to her leg when it hurt, shake her head when something was uncomfortable, and press her hand to her heart when she wanted to show gratitude. The cowboy responded to each gesture, interpreting her needs and reassuring her with gentle words and steady hands. The connection between them grew stronger, built not on language but on trust, patience, and compassion. The town slowly began to change around them. Fear and prejudice still lingered, but the townspeople could no longer ignore the quiet bravery of the cowboy and the resilience of the woman. A few began to speak quietly about what they had seen, remarking that perhaps they had judged her unfairly. Others began to assist in small ways, fetching water, carrying supplies, or simply standing nearby to show that she was not alone. Each act, no matter how minor, built a bridge between the woman and the community. The afternoon brought a new challenge. A small group of men skeptical of the cowboy's efforts began to question his motives openly. "Why do you care so much?" one of them asked, his voice edged with suspicion. "She's not from here, you don't even know her." The cowboy looked at him calmly, without anger. "I know enough," he replied simply. "She is hurt, she needs help, that is all that matters." The words were plain, yet they carried a strength that silenced the crowd for a moment. The skepticism of the few did not deter the cowboy. Instead, it strengthened his resolve. He knew that trust could only grow through action, not words. And so, he continued to care for her tirelessly, showing through every gesture, every small act, that she was worth his effort. Gradually, even the doubters began to soften, unable to deny the truth of what they saw. As evening approached, the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple. The town quieted, and the first stars began to twinkle above. The woman, though still weak, was able to sit up with the cowboy's support. Her eyes followed him as he moved around, and for the first time, she reached out her hand toward him without hesitation. The townspeople watched in silence, realizing that the bond between them was real and genuine. The cowboy took her hand gently, helping her to balance. "There you go," he said softly, smiling. She returned a faint, tentative smile in response. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. She was beginning to feel safe, beginning to trust that someone in this town would protect her, and beginning to believe that she might survive. The townspeople could not ignore the transformation. Some whispered to one another about how the woman's strength and resilience were slowly emerging. Others began to reflect on their own fears and prejudices, realizing that much of their hesitation had been based on ignorance rather than reason. The cowboy's example had shown them that courage was not just about fighting enemies, but also about standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult or unpopular. Night fell, and the town settled into an uneasy quiet. The woman rested on the blanket, her breathing steady, her body recovering slowly. The cowboy remained by her side, keeping watch, his eyes scanning the streets and nearby buildings for any signs of danger. Though the town had begun to soften, he knew that threats could still emerge, both from outside forces and from the lingering prejudices within the town itself. As he sat quietly, the cowboy reflected on the progress made so far. The woman was beginning to trust him. The townspeople were beginning to see her as a person rather than a threat, and small acts of kindness were beginning to emerge among the people. It was not perfect, and there was still much work to be done, but it was a start. And in a place where fear and suspicion had once ruled, even a small start was significant. He also knew that trust was fragile. One wrong word, one careless action, and it could be shattered. So he remained vigilant, patient, and kind, aware that his actions had to be consistent and sincere. He spoke softly to the woman, sang quiet tunes to soothe her, and guided the townspeople in gentle ways that encouraged them to do the right thing. By the time the moon rose high in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the quiet town, the woman had leaned against him comfortably, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. Though exhausted, she seemed calmer than she had been in days. The cowboy adjusted her blanket, ensuring she was warm and secure, and then simply sat beside her, keeping watch. The night was peaceful, yet charged with a quiet sense of hope, a hope that had been absent from the town for far too long. For the first time, the townspeople could see what courage and compassion looked like in practice. They had witnessed a man stand up for someone others had rejected, protect someone others had feared, and care for someone others had abandoned. Slowly, quietly, they began to understand that true strength was not only measured by physical power or wealth, but by the willingness to act with kindness and integrity, even when it was difficult. The woman, though unable to speak, seemed to understand this as well. She shifted slightly in her sleep, a faint sigh escaping her lips, and her hand remained close to the cowboy's. It was a small sign, but a sign nonetheless, of the trust and bond that had begun to grow between them. And so the night passed, calm and quiet, with the cowboy keeping watch, the woman resting, and the town beginning to awaken to the idea that fear could be replaced by courage, and prejudice could give way to compassion. It was a slow process, but every small act of care, every gentle gesture, every word spoken softly in kindness, built the foundation for a stronger connection, not just between the cowboy and the woman, but also between the woman and the town. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the town was once again alive with the sounds of daily life. Yet, amid the familiar routines, there was a subtle shift. People moved with a greater awareness, a new understanding that even the smallest act of kindness could make a profound difference. And for the injured Apache woman, this day marked another step forward towards safety, recovery, and trust, a day that brought her closer to healing not only her body but her spirit as well. The town had grown quieter than usual by the fourth day. A calm settled over the dusty streets, but beneath that calm lay a sense of unease that no one could fully shake. Word had spread quietly through the surrounding areas that an injured Apache woman had been brought into the town, and that a lone cowboy had taken responsibility for her care. Some townspeople whispered that she might be a target for those who wished her harm, and the idea of trouble lurking beyond the horizon hung like a shadow over the community. The cowboy knew that their peace was fragile. He had seen the subtle fear in the eyes of the townspeople, and he understood that not everyone trusted him or her. He had spent the last few days caring for her, teaching her to drink water carefully, to move without causing more pain to her injured leg, and to rest when she needed it. She had begun to respond to his gestures, leaning on him for support, placing her trust in his calm presence. But he also knew that trust alone would not protect her if danger arrived. It was late in the morning when the first sign of trouble appeared. A group of men, mounted on horses and dust swirling around them, rode slowly toward the town. Their expressions were hard, serious, and the way they scanned the streets showed that they were searching for something or someone. The cowboy's eyes narrowed as he observed them. He recognized immediately that these were not simple travelers passing through. They were looking for the injured woman. He quickly stood, moving to position the woman behind a small wooden fence that provided some cover. Though she was still weak, she followed his directions, trembling slightly but trusting his guidance. The cowboy motioned for her to stay low and silent, explaining in his calm, steady voice what she should do. She nodded, understanding the tone even if the words were unfamiliar. The townspeople noticed the group of men approaching and began to stir nervously. Some whispered, "Who are they?" while others muttered warnings to their neighbors. A few of the braver souls stepped closer to the cowboy, hoping to understand what was happening. "Are they dangerous?" one asked quietly. The cowboy did not answer immediately. He knew that appearances could be deceiving. Instead, he scanned the riders carefully, noting their movements and the weapons they carried. The group of men entered the town square, their horses clopping loudly against the wooden sidewalks. They stopped in front of the small area where the woman rested, their eyes scanning for her. The tension in the air was thick, almost tangible. The townspeople held their breath, uncertain of what would happen next. The cowboy stood tall, placing himself between the woman and the men, his calm presence a clear warning that she was not to be harmed. One of the men, seemingly the leader, dismounted and stepped forward, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. "We are looking for a woman," he called, his voice sharp and commanding. "She was last seen in this town. His eyes scanned the crowd, narrowing when they fell on the woman hiding behind the fence. The cowboy shifted slightly, positioning himself so that any attempt to approach her would have to go through him. The tension was unbearable. The townspeople watched silently, their fear almost palpable. Some wanted to flee, while others wanted to help but were unsure how. The cowboy, however, remained calm. He knew that any sudden movement could provoke the men, and he also knew that he needed to protect the woman without escalating the situation. He stepped forward slightly, speaking in a measured tone. "She is not here to cause trouble," he said firmly. "She is injured and weak. You will not find her by threatening this town or its people." The leader of the men laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the square. "Weak or not, she is coming with us," he replied. "We have our orders." The cowboy's eyes did not waver. He knew that negotiation was the only option for now. Slowly, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small pouch of gold coins, the same he had used to motivate the townspeople to help the woman earlier. He held it up for the men to see. "This is for anyone willing to let her stay safe," he said. "You can take the gold and leave peacefully without hurting anyone." The leader's eyes flicked toward the pouch, and for a moment there was a pause. Gold had a powerful influence in the frontier, and the promise of it was often more persuasive than threats. He glanced at his men, then back at the cowboy, and for a tense moment it seemed as if he might accept the offer. But then his expression hardened again and he shook his head. "We are not here for gold," he said. "We are here to bring her back, alive or not." The cowboy's mind raced. He had to act carefully, protecting the woman without endangering the townspeople or himself. He shifted slightly, positioning his body so that any aggressive move toward the woman would be blocked. At the same time, he maintained a calm demeanor, showing no fear and no aggression, only a readiness to defend. The townspeople began to sense the seriousness of the moment. Some of the braver ones moved closer to the cowboy, subtly offering support. Even the young boy who had brought her food now stood nearby, holding a small stick as if to show that he too was willing to protect her. It was a quiet, symbolic act, but it carried meaning. The town was beginning to see the woman not as a stranger, but as someone worth defending. The tension stretched on, the sun beating down on the dusty square, sweat trickling down foreheads, hands tightening around reins and tools, and every eye fixed on the standoff. The cowboy spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "You can take the gold and no one will be hurt. Or you can try to take her by force and I will not let that happen. The choice is yours." The leader's jaw tightened. He had not expected such resistance, nor such composure from a single man. He glanced at his men, and for the first time, a hint of doubt appeared in his eyes. The cowboy's steady presence, his calm authority, and his willingness to protect the woman had begun to change the dynamic. The leader's confidence wavered, though he would not yet admit it. Suddenly, one of the men in the group shifted nervously, stepping slightly back. The cowboy noticed, his eyes flicking toward the man, understanding the unspoken fear. He did not move aggressively but maintained his protective stance, showing that he would act if necessary. The woman, sensing the tension, leaned slightly toward the cowboy, her trust in him clear. She remained quiet, but the strength of her presence was evident. Minutes passed like hours. The sun continued its slow descent, casting long shadows across the town. The townspeople watched, holding their breath, waiting for the moment when the standoff would break. The cowboy's calm and unwavering determination seemed to give them courage. Slowly, they began to whisper among themselves that perhaps standing with him was the right choice, that helping protect the woman was more important than fear or tradition. The leader of the group finally spoke again, his tone quieter than before. "We cannot leave without her," he said, almost to himself. He glanced at the cowboy, studying his unwavering gaze, and for the first time he considered the possibility that violence might not win the day. The cowboy nodded subtly, his stance still firm, still ready to protect, but also showing a willingness to negotiate. Finally, after a long, tense pause, the leader made a decision. He signaled to his men to step back. "We will leave for now," he said, his voice low. "But she is not safe here forever. We will return if we must." With that, the group mounted their horses and rode slowly away, dust rising in their wake. The townspeople exhaled collectively, relief washing over them, though the memory of the tension would linger for days to come. The woman, still leaning on the cowboy, allowed herself a small sigh of relief. Her eyes met his, and though she could not speak the words, her expression was clear: gratitude, trust, and a growing sense of safety. The cowboy adjusted her blanket, ensuring she was comfortable, and then looked around at the townspeople who had witnessed the standoff. Their faces reflected a mixture of awe, shame, and newfound respect. In the following hours, the townspeople began to offer help more willingly. Some brought food and water without hesitation. Others offered clean cloths and simple medicines. The presence of danger had reminded them of the value of life, the importance of courage, and the impact of standing up for what was right. The cowboy, ever patient, guided them gently, showing them how to care for the woman properly and encouraging them to take pride in their small acts of compassion. By evening, the town had shifted once more. Fear was still present, but it was tempered by a sense of community, courage, and moral responsibility. The woman rested comfortably, leaning against the cowboy, her breathing steady and her eyes calm. The standoff had changed more than just the immediate danger. It had transformed the way the town viewed her, themselves, and the cowboy who had stood unwaveringly between danger and safety. As night fell, the stars began to appear in the sky, twinkling above the quiet town. The cowboy remained at her side, keeping watch, knowing that while this threat had passed, the future still held challenges. Yet in that moment there was peace, a fragile but real sense of hope. The town had seen courage, compassion, and the power of standing up for what was right. And the woman, though still weak, had found protection and trust in a world that had seemed cold and unforgiving. The morning after the tense standoff, the town seemed different. The dusty streets were still quiet, but the atmosphere had changed. Fear and suspicion had not completely disappeared, but a subtle shift was noticeable. People moved more cautiously, but with curiosity and respect rather than judgment. The townspeople had witnessed the cowboy's bravery and the resilience of the injured Apache woman. Something in them had begun to stir, a realization that kindness and courage could change even the hardest hearts. The cowboy had spent the night beside the woman, ensuring her safety and comfort. Her breathing was calm, and she slept peacefully for the first time in days. Her injuries, though still serious, were healing steadily under his care. He had carefully cleaned and redressed the wounds, and the woman's movements were becoming less painful. She had even attempted to shift her position on her own, guided gently by the cowboy's steady hands. By mid-morning, the woman was able to sit up slightly. Her dark eyes followed the cowboy's every movement, and for the first time, there was a sense of curiosity in her gaze rather than fear. The townspeople watched from a distance, observing the quiet connection between the two. Even the young boy who had brought her food days before now stood nearby, holding a small basket of fresh water and bread. Slowly, others began to join, offering small gestures of help, a clean cloth, a gentle word, or a quiet presence. The cowboy smiled subtly at the efforts, encouraging the townspeople to see that their small actions could make a real difference. He demonstrated how to help the woman move without causing pain, how to tend to her injuries, and how to communicate through gestures and patience. The woman began to understand the intentions of those around her, responding with small movements, a nod of the head, a hand extended in thanks, or a slight smile that spoke louder than words. As the day progressed, the townspeople began to take a more active role. Some fetched fresh water from the well, others prepared simple food, and a few offered clean blankets and clothing. The town was slowly becoming a place of safety for the woman, a stark contrast to the hesitation and fear that had greeted her arrival. The cowboy remained by her side, guiding the efforts and ensuring that she was treated with care and respect. The woman's recovery continued steadily. She learned to sit up with less support, and she began to move her injured leg carefully, testing her strength and patience. The cowboy was always nearby, ready to assist if she faltered, but allowing her to gain confidence in her own abilities. Each small victory was celebrated quietly, a sip of water taken without spilling, a movement of the leg without a wince, a hand extended toward another person in a gesture of trust. The townspeople watched these moments closely. They began to understand that her strength was not measured by physical power alone, but by resilience, courage, and the ability to trust in someone who showed kindness. Slowly, their fear and prejudice began to soften. They realized that the woman's presence was not a threat, but an opportunity to practice compassion, courage, and humanity. One afternoon, a small group of townspeople approached the cowboy and the woman together. "We want to help," one of them said quietly, a young man who had previously stood back in fear. "We don't want her to leave alone, not without support." The cowboy nodded, appreciating their sincerity. He allowed them to assist in simple tasks, fetching food, preparing clean water, and helping the woman stretch and rest her leg. Each action reinforced the growing trust between the woman and the town. The woman responded in her own way. She began to extend her hand in thanks, offering small gestures of recognition to those who helped her. The townspeople, moved by these subtle acts, felt a sense of pride and connection that they had not anticipated. They had become part of her story, part of her recovery, and part of a moment in the town that would be remembered for years to come. As the days passed, the woman's strength continued to improve. She could sit for longer periods, eat with assistance, and even walk short distances with the cowboy's support. Her eyes, once wide with fear, now held a quiet confidence. She had come to understand that this town, guided by the cowboy's example, could be a place of safety and care. And the cowboy, in turn, felt a deep satisfaction in seeing her resilience and trust grow. The townspeople began to change in subtle ways as well. Fear was replaced with respect and hesitation with courage. Some began to speak openly about the lessons they had learned, the importance of kindness, the value of human life, and the power of standing up for what was right. The young boy who had first offered her food now proudly helped in every task, inspired by the cowboy's courage and the woman's resilience. Others followed in small ways, offering quiet support and encouragement. One afternoon, as the sun cast long golden rays across the town, the woman was able to stand with the cowboy's support. She took slow, careful steps, leaning slightly on his arm. Her eyes met the cowboy's, and a faint smile appeared on her face, a smile of gratitude, trust, and newfound hope. The townspeople watched in silence, moved by the quiet triumph. This simple act of courage and recovery had transformed not only her life but theirs as well. The cowboy spoke softly to her, explaining in simple words what he had done to protect her and how the townspeople had come to help. Though she could not understand every word, she grasped the meaning through his gestures, tone, and expressions. She reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder, a gesture of trust and recognition that spoke louder than language. By evening, the town had gathered quietly to witness the progress of the woman. They had begun to accept her as part of their community, at least in spirit, and they had begun to reflect on the courage it took to stand up for someone in need. The cowboy, ever modest, did not seek praise. He remained focused on her safety and comfort, guiding the townspeople gently and allowing them to contribute in ways they felt capable. The woman's recovery continued over the following days. She grew stronger, walking further each day, and engaging more confidently with the few townspeople who had shown kindness. She began to recognize familiar faces, offering small gestures of gratitude and connection. The town, in turn, had learned the value of courage, compassion, and moral responsibility. They had seen firsthand how one person's actions could inspire change and transform fear into understanding. One morning, the woman stood in the town square, fully supported by the cowboy but moving with greater independence. The townspeople gathered quietly, witnessing the transformation. She had become a symbol of resilience and hope, a living reminder of the power of trust and kindness. The cowboy, watching her steady steps, felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had not only protected her life, but had also helped the town see the value of compassion and bravery. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the woman took a small step forward, away from the cowboy, and then returned, placing her hand on his shoulder once more. The gesture was simple, yet powerful. It spoke of trust, safety, and the bond that had formed between them. The townspeople, witnessing this, felt a profound sense of pride and humility. They had learned that courage was not just physical strength or wealth. It was the willingness to act with integrity and kindness when it mattered most. Finally, the woman was ready to make a choice about her future. With the cowboy by her side, she could return to her tribe, continue her journey, or remain in the town that had slowly come to accept her. The townspeople watched quietly, respecting her decision and offering support in their own way. She looked around at the faces, taking in the kindness, courage, and compassion she had witnessed. Then, with a small nod, she made her choice, one that reflected her trust in the cowboy and the lessons she had learned about courage, care, and community. The cowboy helped her prepare for the journey ahead, ensuring she had food, water, and supplies. The townspeople offered small gifts, gestures of goodwill, and quiet words of encouragement. The woman, now strong and confident, smiled faintly, her dark eyes shining with gratitude. She understood the lessons she had learned, not only about trust in others but also about her own resilience and strength. As she departed, the cowboy stood quietly, watching her walk confidently into the horizon. The townspeople remained behind, reflecting on the events they had witnessed and the lessons they had learned. Fear had been replaced with courage, suspicion with understanding, and hesitation with compassion. The town had changed, if only a little, and the memory of the injured Apache woman and the cowboy who had protected her would remain as a symbol of hope and humanity. That night, as stars twinkled above the quiet town, the cowboy rode slowly toward the edge of the settlement. He had completed his task, not seeking recognition or reward, but finding fulfillment in knowing that a life had been saved, and a community had begun to awaken to the value of courage and kindness. The woman's presence, her resilience, and the townspeople's transformation were a testament to the power of compassion and the difference one person could make. The town, once hesitant and fearful, had learned that helping someone in need could inspire change and bring out the best in people. The injured Apache woman, once abandoned and feared, had found safety, trust, and a renewed sense of hope. And the cowboy, quiet and humble, had reminded everyone that true courage was not only in facing danger, but also in standing up for what was right, even when no one else would. In the end, the story of the injured woman and the brave cowboy became a part of the town's history, a tale of resilience, compassion, and moral courage. It reminded the townspeople that even in a harsh and unforgiving world, kindness, trust, and bravery could make a difference. And it showed that every life, no matter how small or vulnerable, was worth protecting, respected, and valued.